Jim Wallace was slapped with a $3,000 view tax just for building a barn on his own land. Behind it all stood Brad Henley, a smug HOA president who used fine print to push out anyone who didn't fit his polished vision. But Jim had one thing Brad didn't: a signed letter that turned the board's scheme into their own financial downfall. And just wait until you hear how justice rolled down that mountain like thunder. Jim Wallace wasn't a man easily rattled. After 20 years in the Army Corps of Engineers and another 10 hauling timber across the Cumberland Plateau, he'd developed a deep appreciation for two things: peace and boundaries. That's why, when he retired and bought his 8-acre slice of Tennessee hill country, he'd thought he was finally done with nonsense. No bosses, no backhanded politics, and especially no one telling him what he could or couldn't build on his land. So when he decided to put up a 2-story barn behind his house, he didn't ask anyone's permission. He didn't need to. The structure was practical, functional, and well within zoning: corrugated tin roof, clean red siding, basic loft space for storing tools and winter feed. No plumbing, no lighting beyond solar, and it was a full 100 feet from any neighbor's fence line. He even filed the construction notice with the county just to be safe. Not that it was required. Then came the foggy morning that changed everything. Jim walked out to the mailbox with a thermos of black coffee in one hand, still in his boots and flannel. He flipped through bills and circulars until he reached a stiff envelope marked "Certified" in red ink, the HOA's emblem embossed at the corner like a stamp of arrogance. He opened it right there on the gravel drive. The letter began with cordial language: "Dear Mr. Wallace." But what followed knocked the wind out of him. The HOA had voted, without warning or public input, to impose a new annual view tax on structures deemed to obstruct communal mountain sightlines. His barn, they claimed, diminished the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood and thus triggered a $3,000 yearly assessment. It didn't feel real at first. Jim stood there for a full minute, the chill from the morning mist settling into his bones, rereading the words as if they might rearrange into something that made sense. But they didn't. It was all there in black and white, signed by the HOA president himself, Brad Henley. That name sent a very different kind of chill down Jim's spine. Brad Henley wasn't just any board member. He was the kind of man who wore polished boots to his mailbox and corrected people when they called his house a home. It was an estate, he'd say. Brad's house was one street over and perched at the top of the loop, facing away from Jim's property entirely. There was no conceivable way he could even see the barn, unless he flew a drone over the treetops, and knowing Brad, he probably had. That night, Jim didn't sleep much. Around 11, he poured himself one final cup of coffee and climbed up to the loft of the barn. The sky was clear, stars smeared across the dark like salt on velvet. From up there, he had a perfect view of the valley and of the oversized, overvalued homes of the HOA board members, glowing in neat little clusters like electric castles. Each one of them had paved patios, 2-story decks, glass balconies facing the West Ridge. They didn't seem concerned with aesthetic harmony when it came to their own builds. And that's when it hit him. This wasn't about scenic character. It wasn't about the barn. It was about control. And maybe, just maybe, envy. His barn stood tall, built with his own hands, on land he'd paid off outright. That kind of independence didn't sit well with people like Brad Henley. Jim looked out over the rooftops, then down at the tax notice still folded in his coat pocket. A slow, knowing smile crept across his face. Let them enjoy the view while it lasted. They had no idea what kind of storm was about to roll in, and it wasn't coming from the sky. Brad Henley had a way of speaking that made your skin crawl. He could be perfectly polite, but everything he said came with a faint aftertaste of condescension, like he was always trying to remind you that he had just a little more money, a little more power, and a better idea of how things ought to be. To Brad, people like Jim Wallace weren't neighbors. They were obstacles, background characters in a curated lifestyle he'd been building ever since he moved out from Nashville and helped found the HOA 15 years ago. Brad styled himself as a visionary. He was a real estate broker with a flair for language, using words like elevated living and scenic uniformity, while quietly pushing zoning changes that favored developers and penalized longtime residents. He sold people dreams of quiet mountain charm, but once they moved in, he made sure they paid for it in dues, rules, and red tape. To Brad, Jim's barn was more than an eyesore. It was a reminder that some people didn't play by his rules, and that was a threat. The rest of the HOA board wasn't much better. There was Dr. Rowland, a retired dentist who fancied himself an amateur architect and built a white-columned gazebo straight out of a Roman fever dream. Marlene, a self-described mountain influencer, hosted wine and crystal parties on her cantilevered deck and posted photos of her charcuterie boards with hashtags like #ElevatedRetreatLife. And then there was Dr. Ethan Vale, a plastic surgeon who had converted his backyard into a luxury spa, complete with marble statues, LED fountains, and a stone fire pit the size of a compact car. They were the tastemakers of the neighborhood, and while they preached natural design integrity, they paved, landscaped, and accessorized their homes to look like boutique resorts. Jim, by contrast, had kept things simple: gravel driveway, rainwater cistern, barn siding stained by hand. It wasn't flashy, but it was honest, and that, more than any height restriction or sightline impairment, is what really got under their skin. So, when the HOA sent him the view tax letter, Jim didn't just feel blindsided, he felt insulted. They hadn't even bothered to pretend it was about aesthetics. It was pure posturing, a show of power dressed up in legalese. And that's when something shifted in Jim. He could have filed an appeal, written letters, called a lawyer, but instead, he quietly printed out the letter and took a drive down to the county tax assessor's office. The building was plain, the staff polite but harried, and when Jim stepped up to the counter with his copy of the view tax, the clerk didn't even try to hide her confusion. "I'm sorry," she said, squinting at the letter. "They're fining you for having a barn?" Jim nodded. "They say it blocks the mountain view." She raised an eyebrow. "Whose view?" Jim didn't answer. He just smiled and handed her the next page. It was the HOA's declaration, signed by all 4 board members, officially designating his barn as an obstruction to community sightlines. She called in a supervisor. When the supervisor arrived and read the documents, he let out a quiet whistle. "You're telling me they filed this? In writing?" Jim nodded again. The supervisor leaned back and shook his head slowly, the beginnings of a grin forming at the corners of his mouth. "Well," he said, tapping the paper, "I hope they enjoy sunsets, because if they're claiming their views have taxable value, they just volunteered for premium assessment." And just like that, Jim saw the crack in the armor. Under state property law, any home that's officially classified as having protected or scenic view rights falls into a separate taxation bracket. It's designed to catch vacation homes and high-end estates with panoramic outlooks, and comes with a heavy price tag. By trying to fine Jim for blocking a view, the HOA had unintentionally declared their own homes as having special protected views. Jim walked out of that office with nothing more than a manila folder, but he held it like a loaded slingshot. Brad Henley had made a mistake, a big one, and Jim intended to make sure he paid every penny for it. 3 weeks after Jim's visit to the county tax office, a pair of white SUVs rolled into the neighborhood just after sunrise. Their sides bore the seal of the state assessor's office, and their trunks opened to reveal cases of precision tools, tripod scanners, and high-resolution drones equipped with thermal cameras and GPS overlays. Most residents assumed they were there for a random audit, until the crews began methodically measuring view angles from every back porch and deck along the western ridge. It was no longer just a barn dispute. They mapped out slope grades, treetop canopy heights, and the natural curvature of the valley. Properties that once boasted million-dollar views were now being evaluated like resort estates. And the data didn't lie. Brad Henley's home was the first to be hit. With its elevated position and sweeping glass balcony facing the ridge, it was reclassified as a luxury property with protected viewscape, which triggered a 22% increase in annual taxes. His formerly manageable bill ballooned by over $18,000 per year. Marlene, the so-called mountain influencer, was next. Her wraparound deck, featured in dozens of online lifestyle posts, was now legally recognized as a premium sunset-facing amenity. That came with a newly levied feature surcharge, adding $12,600 to her tax bill. She tried arguing it was just aesthetic, but the assessor's report included photographic evidence and even listed the Ridgeview Retreat tag as evidence of value. Then came Dr. Ethan Vale. His terraced spa area, complete with wet bar, heat lamps, and imported stonework, was reclassified under commercial-grade leisure zoning. The county labeled it an unregistered multi-tier wellness feature, resulting in a 5-figure improvement tax. And since he hadn't disclosed those upgrades on previous filings, the county flagged him for retroactive back tax assessment. Ethan went pale when he heard the word audit. Jim said nothing publicly during all this. He didn't need to. He just kept showing up to HOA meetings like usual, quiet and steady, while the board members scrambled behind the scenes, whispering over spreadsheets and placing calls to attorneys they hadn't needed in years. And then came the meeting where everything boiled over. It was held in the usual place, the community clubhouse, which now felt more like a courtroom than a neighborhood hall. Brad stood at the front like always, but the confidence was gone. His shirt collar was tight, his smile brittle. His voice wavered slightly as he addressed the members. "In light of recent reassessments," he began, "we are exploring options to reduce visual obstructions that may be impacting property values. As such, we are requesting that Mr. Wallace consider voluntarily removing or reducing the height of his barn in the spirit of community preservation." Jim didn't rise from his seat. He didn't need to raise his voice. He simply leaned forward, opened a folder, and slid a set of printed documents across the table to Brad. It was a spreadsheet, neatly formatted, color-coded, and painfully clear. It listed the new tax burdens of each board member, side by side with their previous rates. Brad stared at it for a long moment before Jim finally broke the silence. "You raised my view tax by $3,000, Jim said evenly. "The county raised yours by $65. I'd say the barn's doing just fine where it is." There was a long pause. No one spoke. No one moved. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Brad didn't answer. His jaw flexed once, then twice. He folded the spreadsheet, hands trembling ever so slightly, and sat down without another word. And in that moment, everyone in the room realized the balance had shifted. Jim hadn't just won the argument. He'd flipped the script entirely. In the weeks that followed the tax bombshell, the neighborhood took on a different kind of quiet. The kind that settles in when those who used to throw their weight around start to pack up and disappear. One by one, for sale signs appeared in front of the houses that had once loomed so confidently above the valley. The socialite was the first to go. Her agent posted that the owners were relocating to pursue creative opportunities. The retired dentist followed, citing downsizing. But everyone knew the real reason. They couldn't afford the very premium view rights they'd tried to weaponize against Jim. And Brad Henley? He didn't go quietly. He filed a formal appeal with the county, citing unfair taxation and hardship. But the letter he'd proudly sent to Jim, the one that labeled the barn an obstruction of communal scenic value, was now working against him. Signed, dated, and embossed with HOA letterhead, it became Exhibit A in the county's decision to uphold the reassessment. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He tried to backpedal, claiming the letter was symbolic, but the assessor's office had already entered the classification into the public record. It was permanent. Brad could either pay or sell. He chose to sell. Meanwhile, Jim didn't say much. He wasn't one to gloat. But what he did do spoke volumes. He added solar panels to the barn roof, refinished the interior with salvaged wood, and leased the upstairs space to a local nonprofit that ran weekend programs for at-risk youth, teaching carpentry, wildlife conservation, and basic farm skills. The barn that once sparked fines and fury became a hub of quiet learning and laughter. Because the barn remained agricultural in function, Jim's zoning classification and his taxes stayed exactly where they were, low and untouched. Even better, other neighbors started asking if they could use the space too, for gardening clubs, seasonal craft fairs, and even a veterans meetup. The barn had become something larger than a structure. It was a symbol. And eventually, change came. The next HOA election was the most attended in neighborhood history. People who had once stayed silent showed up with ballots in hand. Brad and his allies were voted out in a landslide. Jim was elected to the board by unanimous vote, and in their first official act, the new leadership moved to abolish the view tax entirely. But they didn't stop there. The board issued a formal, written apology to Jim Wallace, acknowledging that the fine had been a misuse of policy and power inconsistent with the values of this community. The letter was mailed to every resident. Jim read it once, folded it carefully, and tucked it in a drawer, not out of spite, but because it was done. There was nothing left to prove. On a quiet Sunday morning, he climbed the ladder to the barn loft with a thermos in one hand and a notebook in the other. The fog hung low across the ridges, curling through the trees like silk. Below, the valley was still, no drama, no board politics, no noise. He took a sip of hot coffee and leaned against the window frame, looking out across the land he'd fought to protect. The view was just as it had always been, steady, quiet, his. But the feeling in his chest, that was justice, and it was better than any view money could buy.